explain the format. I believe you all have a schedule in front of you. Did everybody get one?
There you go.
Okay. You'll notice that it's different every week. This is really a collaborative effort involving a whole lot of people from the Bluegrass Association. So first of all, Lynn Lipton, the young blonde by the door, is the program director, for want of a better title, for the Hudson Valley Bluegrass Association. And she is the one who has done just tons and tons of work to pull this together. Then, the way it's going to work most weeks is that the first half of the session will be discussion with anywhere from 1 to 3 people presenting. And then the second portion will be a musician or musicians demonstrating their instruments. Today we're going to be featuring Kalia Yeagle on Fiddle, and Jerry Oland on Banjo, who's also going to be one of the presenters. Jerry in the middle there. And Eric-Rosi, Marshall, will be performing on guitar, and he's also one of the speakers today. A couple of things I want to mention before we get started, because in case I forget. Next week is really special too. We're departing from the format. We're going to have 3 people who are associated with the Gray Fox Bluegrass Festival every year, and one of them is Ruth Oxenberg, who made a film of the Bluegrass, featuring the Gray Fox Bluegrass Festival called Bluegrass Journey. She and Mary Daub and Mary Burdett, who are organizers of the festival, will be here. The 3 of them will be presenting. So that's going to be really exciting. They're going to show clips from the movie. Then, let me see. Oh, another really big day. On April 25th, Lynn, through her powers of persuasion, has managed to enlist Bill Keith. I don't know how many of you have heard of Bill Keith, but you should have. He's, along with Earl Scruggs, whom we lost last week, as you know, those 2 are probably the most influential banjo players of the century. Today we wanted to take up the background of the events and people and trends that led up to Bluegrass. Bluegrass didn't suddenly appear out of whole cloth in the 1940s. There are a couple centuries of things leading up to that, and we're going to touch upon some of those influences. It's going to be a bit superficial. I mean, we're talking about massive things in a very short period of time, but I think you'll find it interesting. One thing I wanted to bring out was that bluegrass music has one of its origins all the way back in the 18th century, early 1700s in Appalachia, when the Scots-Irish and English settled in these little enclaves up in the hills and largely provided their own entertainment before TV, before records, before radio. And a major source of that entertainment was through music. You've probably heard of the English ballads that have been traced to Appalachia and recorded. They have found versions. I know the Child Ballads book tracked down something like 18 different versions of Barbara Allen, going back to England. And the Scots in particular brought a lot of the fiddle music and dance. And we're going to be hearing fiddle music later on. A little bit later, the banjo came in via West African slaves by way of blackface minstrel shows, and then more into old-time music. But as I said, most of the musicians were self-taught and performed primarily for themselves and their families and for dances, and it stayed pretty much where it was.
What's the origin of the word fiddle to use in terms instead of violin?
That's a great question. Kalia, do you have an answer for that?
I don't have an answer for that.
It's the same instrument. It's held differently. Kalia will demonstrate later on. But how it came to be called a fiddle, I don't have a clue. Does anybody?
Maybe fiddling around.
I think that came after, but I'm not certain. I think that concept of fiddling was a little bit later. Yeah. There were 3 major things that came together that changed things permanently, and catalysts that converged and each reinforced the other. One of these was the popularity of the phonograph, which had been invented decades before, but really didn't come into popular use until the early 1920s. That was a major change. And there is one right there. And some of the original labels. OK was a huge label in the South and in the history of old time and early bluegrass music. The second factor that was major, oh yeah, I love this poster, besides the phonograph, was radio. And that also changed things dramatically. In the early 20s, as phonographs became more available and records became more popular, there was a big rush to try to get musicians to perform, to record, to make the records. And we stumbled upon this one, Columbia, which is still around, by the way, but was one of the early labels as well. They sent out posters and recruited, and they sent down what we would call A&R men down throughout the South to invite people to come in for auditions and for recording sessions. One of them, Eric, is going to go into one recording session. What was it? The Big Bang recording session, which he'll discuss later. And radio. Two stations in particular that come to mind. One was in Chicago, the WLS, which had a program called the National Barn Dance, for which they recruited a lot of old-time musicians to perform. And it was, interestingly, the station was owned by Sears Roebuck, hence the letters WLS, which stood for World's Largest Store. And then the other biggie in Nashville was WSM, which was also owned by a private company, the National Life and Accident Insurance Company, hence the title WSM, We Shield Millions. That's true, I didn't make that up. The radio programs and the phonograph records found a ready-built audience in one case because of the recent migration into urban areas from Appalachia. And people got homesick. And they're a ripe audience for radio programs catering to them and phonograph records with the music. Conversely, the migration to the cities and the growing popularity of records and radio provided work for a lot of people, a lot of musicians who suddenly decided, gee, maybe I can make a living doing this. One of the earliest groups was J.E. Mayner's Mountaineers, who were very popular in the mid-1920s and on. In fact, after J.E. Mayner left, it was carried on by his son. Lynn, how do I get the music together? Just click it again. Give you a brief taste. Oh, here we go. As you can probably tell, this is not quite the driving music we associate with bluegrass, but it's laying the bedrock here. Notice something interesting here too that you'll see again and again with these groups. Notice the hats. Frequently, bands would come out dressed fairly formally, even in the recording studios and on radio stations, with the favored cowboy hats, riding jodhpurs. Phil Monroe's band, for example, he had a strict dress code for his players. There were no shabby, scraggly hippies in these bands. That didn't fly. Another popular group, Gid Tanner and his Skillet Lickers. I love their names. They're great names. Gid Tanner was a hugely popular fiddler who was one of his biggest rivals was Fiddlin' John Carson, and the two of them would play all over the South. And whoever didn't win the contest one time would win it the next. It went back and forth between the two of them. I have a scary picture here of Gid Tanner, I think. Oh, we're getting here yet.
Yeah, well, again, let's get it. Next is ready to go. We'll play another tune this morning. I want you to grab that gal and shake her booty. Come on. Don't you let them dance on your new carpet. You make them roll it up.
Are you guys going to play this later? Lady chance? As you can tell, this is dance music. By the way, when these guys were rehearsing outside, I saw a lot of people nearby, a lot of foot tapping, head bobbing. It's infectious.
Taking in a break, scratching that door, brand when you don't find no time. Lay down there and just get there, holding you, don't let her
This is another duo. Joe and Odell Thompson played dance music primarily, and primarily for African American audiences. But there was a lot of interchange, as you will hear later in the program. It wasn't country music in general, and bluegrass in particular, I think has a popular image of being the ultimate all-white thing, and it's not, as you will see. There are influences from all over, and clearly the banjo is a major source that was definitely not originally an all-white instrument. And these two guys were performing well into the 70s, and you can find them on YouTube. They're pretty impressive. And I love Odell. He's the one with the banjo, the hair.
I can eat them. Wait a minute.
We get to hear it.
Back in.
In anybody's living room. This is not the slick, polished music that was to come. Here's one of my favorites. Uncle Dave Macon was huge. He was Grand Ole Opry's first star back in about 1927 when Grand Ole Opry started. And he's been labeled as the bridge between the 19th century and the 20th. The 19th century in the era of vaudeville and folk, old-time music, and the 20th century, the era of phonographs and radios. And he was a wildly popular entertainer. In fact, usually if you look anything up for him, you see him listed first as entertainer, secondly as musician. And I think that kind of shows in this picture. But he was very energetic right up until his last days. He just won audiences over. He remained one of Grand Ole Opry's most popular performers when he wasn't touring. One of his songs that I like the most, that he wrote, based upon the Coal Creek Wars in eastern Tennessee. I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's a coal mining area, and the government hired out prisoners to do the work of the coal miners in an attempt to bust unions. And he wrote a ballad called Buddy Won't You Roll Down the Line, which later I first heard in the early 60s in a recording made by Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and the Talking Union. And it's become a standard among folk music singers, and I'll play a bit of it, I think. Yeah.
Come in and high. Way back yonder in Tennessee, down east the convicts down. They worked their way in the coal mines against free labor stuff. Free labor ain't best against it, doing it in some time. But while the days was in a big to meet a bride.
Notice the sort of, it's a combination of really simple frailing and early folk with a more polished stage act, I think. Doc Boggs, another big name at the time, especially in the 20s and 30s, when he started out with his Cumberland Mountain Entertainers. He actually, in the early 20s, he and his band were pulling in an estimated between $300 and $400 a week, which then was a whole lot of money. He was hugely popular, but then along came the Depression, and all of a sudden people weren't buying records. And he set aside his banjo and returned to coal mining for most of his life until the mid-1960s when Mike Seeger rediscovered him, and along with a whole lot of other people that Mike Seeger rediscovered. Mike's the half-brother of Pete. You're probably familiar with him. We lost him a couple of years ago too, unfortunately. But he almost, I won't say single-handedly, but he, along with Ralph Rinsler and a couple other people, probably did more to resurrect the careers of some really brilliant folk musicians than about anybody else I can think of, except maybe the Lomaxes. And then finally, my favorite, Snuffy Jenkins. Now, I'm going to play a clip of his, and you'll see the difference. To my mind, out of all of these people you've seen, Snuffy Jenkins he's the first one that really, I think, is doing bluegrass. He was a very gifted three-fingered picker. He had started with Maynard's Mountaineers early on, and was with other bands as well. But his three-fingered picking style is very distinctive, and he was a major influence on some better-known five-string players, Don Reno, Earl Scruggs. There was a rumor that he had taught Earl Scruggs to play banjo. That's not true, but Scruggs did acknowledge him as an influence on him, and I think you'll see why when you hear him. Hear the difference? So I'm going to turn the podium over now to Jerry, who's going to follow another strand of music leading up to bluegrass. Jerry?
Thank you. Enter Bill Monroe. Bill Monroe was born in Kentucky, Western Kentucky in 1911, and today he's known as the father of bluegrass music. But he and his brother Charlie had a very successful career as a duo act during the 1930s. They cut a lot of records and were very popular. And then when they split up, Bill Monroe started his own band, which he called the Bluegrass Boys, in part because Kentucky was known as the bluegrass state. And Bill had certain definite ideas of what he wanted in his music. And he had a piercing, very powerful, high tenor vocal, and he wanted to have a fiddle. He wanted to have that fiddle influence in his music, and he wanted to have gospel music in his music, in bluegrass. And another thing he wanted was the blues. He had been influenced, he actually spoke about this, by an African-American guitar and fiddle player named Arnold Schultz, who played a lot in the area where he lived, where he grew up. And one of his first paid jobs, Bill's first paid jobs, was playing along with Arnold, who not only played guitar, but he played fiddle. And Arnold Schultz has been credited as, there are no recorded examples of his playing, but he has been credited by Chet Atkins, Merle Travis, and Ike Everly, the father of the Everly brothers, as helping to develop their styles. Another influence, the Mississippi Sheiks were an all-black string band that was recorded successfully in the 1930s. They were marketed to both black and white people. And here's an example of them doing a song that Bill Monroe later did in a bluegrass style. I'll hopefully have that example to play for you as well. So here's Mississippi Sheiks, who, as far as I know, are the first to record Sitting on Top of the World. But did it very much more up-tempo, and hopefully that'll be the next example. So Bill Monroe was very influenced by the blues, and interestingly, my first encounter of that song was with Bill Monroe's version. But in the 1970s, I went to New York City to see Howlin' Wolf, who was a Chicago bluesman, but he was from Mississippi, and he did that song very similar to the Mississippi Sheiks, who I hadn't heard of at that time. And the thought immediately came to my mind, that's how the song was written. Bill Monroe, I think in 1939, joined the Grand Ole Opry with the Bluegrass Boys. He was, every week they had a live radio show. And the only African-American performer on there was a harmonica player named DeFord Bailey. And I think he stopped playing on the Opry in 1941, but Bill Monroe learned a tune from him that he later incorporated in the bluegrass repertoire and credited DeFord Bailey. So first we're going to hear DeFord Bailey playing, I think, the Pan American Blues. Imitating the sound of a train, much in the same way that a fiddle does in Orange Blossom Special. I don't have a recording of DeFord Bailey doing Evening Prayer Blues, but this is the tune that Bill Monroe played on mandolin, recorded it, and credited DeFord Bailey. This is not Bill Monroe's version, but it's close, and it's by a great mandolin player named Alan Bybee. Wanted to put in one more example of how eclectic Bill Monroe was in his choice of material. This is a tune that he wrote, and he called it Cheyenne, and I think that it has a touch of American Indian music in it as well. So I just wanted to play this for you.
Eric-Rosi is going to take us one step further toward bluegrass with a discussion of the all-time most, what's the word for people who create thousands of things? The Carter family probably created more songs for bluegrass and folk in general than any other group I can think of. Eric?
Are you looking for the word prolific?
That's it.
Great, thank you very much. All right, so yeah, it's my privilege. I think I got pulled the lucky straw that I get to talk about the Carter family today. All of this is in the context of the history of bluegrass music, which I don't know if all of you came here because you already know about bluegrass music or are interested in discovering what it is. We've alluded to the fact it's often kind of epitomized by the music of Bill Monroe, as I think Jerry has pointed out, and we've got a chance to hear. It's exemplified in the banjo style of Earl Scruggs, who started out, really made his name with Bill Monroe, and went on to have a great career of his own, independent. And lots of people have come through Bill Monroe's band over the years. You're going to hear a lot more about that in a couple of weeks. Bluegrass music was once described, I think it was by Ralph Rinsler that you mentioned, as folk music in overdrive. As I said, once you get into the golden age of bluegrass in a couple of weeks, you'll hear a lot more detail. But just to set that up, as this is sort of the precursors of that style. But of course, all these precursors are worthy stories in their own right. And of course, the Carter family very much among them. So to some extent, I want to tell their story and then also tie that into the context of the evolution of music in America in the 20th century. All right, the Carter family is often referred to as the first family of country music, excuse me. And because of a lot of the factors that Mike alluded to, the rise of mass communication in the form of radio and recorded music, electrically recorded music, and the movement of populations out of rural pockets into cities for economic reasons. They were part of this moment in history and helped bring music down from the mountains, from these little hollers way up where they were just family music, and helped spread them really from coast to coast, from sea to sea. They were ultimately a family of several generations who have been around in part of American country music for 85 years now. From the Great Depression, from before the Great Depression when they first recorded, through the Great Depression, the country boom of the 40s and 50s, exemplified by the Grand Ole Opry, to the folk revival of the 60s and 70s, to most recently the movie in 1990s, 2000, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? There are constantly Carter family revivals. Their music comes back into fashion, and usually there's some members of the Carter family there to help it along. So along with the story of the music, there's the story of the technology which met the tradition that Mike talked about. All right, the Big Bang of country music refers to a recording session in Bristol, Tennessee, August 1st and 2nd of 1927. The dashing young man there in the corner is Mr. Ralph Peer, who came down from New York City, I believe, with a deal that if he could find hillbilly music to record, he could get a piece of the action. He was basically a talent scout for recording companies. And so he posted a flyer, like the one Mike showed you earlier, for open auditions. Anyone who wanted to could come and audition, and if he liked you, he'd record you, he'd give you $50 per song. This was in Bristol, Tennessee, up in the mountains of Mesa Spring, Virginia, also known as Poor Valley. Not that many miles away from Bristol, but in those days, a hard road to travel, sat the Carter family, and the paterfamilias was A.P. Carter, and he was determined to go down with his wife, Sarah, and his sister-in-law, Maybelle, to try to impress Mr. Peer. And sure enough, his wife, Sarah, was 8 months pregnant. Nonetheless, they got into that rattly old Ford, and down the rough road, I believe they broke down several times, and sang a few songs for Mr. Peer, and he was very positively impressed. He recorded them right away. He recorded 6 to 8 songs in those 2 days, and they got $50 for each one, and he immediately then also set up more recording sessions for them up in Camden, New Jersey, and also down in Atlanta, Georgia. So they just wander down that rough road from the mountains, and all of a sudden they're in this very urban circuit of the modern recording industry. They ended up becoming the biggest selling vocal group. As you heard before, a lot of the popular music recorded was fiddle music or banjo music, instruments that have a very clear, piercing tone that was picked up well by early recording instruments. But again, we have the technology that Ralph Peer has portable recording equipment. That was a novel thing. He didn't have to go all the way to New York to record necessarily. He could do a rough recording with portable equipment. He set up in that hat factory you see up in the top left corner, and listen to everyone who wanted to audition. Another fellow came along on that same audition call named Jimmy Rogers, known as the Oland Brakeman, another huge early country star. And so I'm going to play you a little audio track here, and you're going to hear a little bit of the Carter family, as well as some of Jimmy Rogers, both recorded within these 2 days, first 2 days of August 1927. As you're listening, you'll notice the instrumentation for the Carter family includes guitar and auto harp, both of which are much gentler instruments than the fiddle or the banjo, at least in the context of how it would be picked up by recording equipment. But because the equipment was more sophisticated, it worked. And you start to hear 2- and 3-part harmony, which was also relatively novel in country music records. Okay, and then you get to hear a little bit of Jimmy Rogers yodel.
My heart is sad and I'm in sorrow for the only one I love. When shall I see him home? No, never till I meet him in heaven above.
Another mule skinner out on your new mud line.
And both of those songs were eventually recorded by Monroe and put in overdrive, and the yodeling, that high sound that you hear in Jimmy Rogers' first recordings, was something that I think that Bill Monroe was clearly drawn to. Yes?
Was that clip of Jimmy Rogers, was that from that?
I don't know if that, I do not believe it was from that actual recording session. I don't know if it was.
Really impressive.
Yeah. I don't remember exactly which tunes he brought to the audition. But the Weeping Willow definitely was, Burning Beneath the Weeping Willow. All right. Next I want to take a quick focus at each member of the Carter family. First we have Sarah. She's standing there in front with her hands on the auto harp, and people, Ralph Peer first among them, but everyone really fell in love with her voice. It is very melancholy, mournful, and yet I think, as both Mike and Jerry mentioned, it reminded people of home too. Their songs are surprisingly sad and nostalgic for something as popular. Often we think of popular entertainment as being distracting and happy-go-lucky, and their music certainly wasn't, and yet it was immensely popular. Again, her voice could be captured by the recording equipment of the time. You didn't have to have just a high tenor voice. This is, I believe, the recording is what I think it is. It's really rather low in the register. It's high in the register.
She's going dressed fine. Oh, she's going dressed fine. Married girl, she wears just any kind. Oh, she wears just any kind.
Okay. Her sister-in-law was Maybelle Carter, a few years younger, and Maybelle is usually singing harmony with Sarah, if at all, although that last one you heard was just Sarah by herself. And one of her greatest influences is that of her guitar style, which she developed totally on her own up in the hills of Fore Valley. And it's often referred to as the Carter scratch, or Carter-style guitar. And what she was able to do on just one instrument by herself was to pick out melody notes in the on the lower strings, the bass strings of the guitar, and at the same time keep a rhythmic momentum going with a strumming on the higher strings. So she almost divided the guitar in two, accompaniment and melody. And this is sort of the baseline guitar style for every acoustic guitarist in the 20th century and beyond. Many styles develop out of that. but she really had the first really distinctive, personalized guitar style, at least in what was then called hillbilly music. This is not to speak, of course, of all the... there were other talent scouts working the Mississippi Delta looking for blues musicians. These were different segments of the recording industry. You had the hillbilly music and you had the race records, as they were called. And so clearly this is on the hillbilly side of the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so we get to hear a little bit of Carter Scratch guitar style in this next audio clip.
Would you let her part us, darling? Could you truly turn away? Would it make your heart ache, darling, not to see me night or day? I've been dreaming of you, darling, dreaming of your eyes so blue. Take me back, for love I'm dying, for I love none else but you.
Okay, so that was called Broken Hearted Love, recorded in 1932 in Camden, New Jersey. And there again, there now you get to hear Sarah's lower register, really, really lovely and heartbreaking, really. Okay, and then AP, there, now he's standing in front there in this beautiful photograph. He was the least musically noteworthy of the three, but he made up for it with a lot of hustle. Remember, he's the one who dragged them down the hill in the first place. And then when he learned what the deal was, what money might be made, both first for just the recordings, but then also Ralph Peer offered to share a copyright publishing credit. So any songs that he wrote himself or could have claimed to have written for himself, they would both put their names on the copyright. So you had Carter and Ralph Peer both putting themselves down as publishers and composers. Well, so AP started with songs he had found or could find around the house and in his family traditions. But he became what often is termed a song catcher, or what we nowadays would, if you go to study it in college, you're an ethnomusicologist. You start walking the hillsides, going from house to house, and asking folks to share the songs they have and they know. And he basically traveled in ever wider circles to gather more songs. They'd go and record them, he'd go back out, and so he was a really wonderful song collector. Whether or not he was a prolific composer, I don't know, but he was a very capable song collector. And as he widened his circle and as he wanted to gain entrance to other communities, he actually started traveling with an African-American friend of his named Leslie, or Esley Riddle. So you had, it was an integrated song hunting team they had there in the southern Appalachian Mountains. So again, these communities were not as divided and separated as we sometimes think, certainly, and especially in rural areas. All right, so ultimately the Carter family recorded over 350 songs, many of which have entered the folk canon. Songs like John Hardy, The Wildwood Flower, I'm Thinking Tonight of My Blue Eyes, Motherless Children, The Wabash Cannonball, Worried Man Blues was a huge hit in 1931, I believe, or 1930, like right after the beginning of the Depression, when everyone had a worried mind. He had Worried Man Blues. When the World's on Fire, a gospel tune that Woody Guthrie liked so much, he used it as the melody for This Land Is Your Land. My Little Home in Tennessee, Gold Watch and Chain, East Virginia Blues, Are You Tired of Me, My Darling, I Know What It Means to Be Lonesome, Will You Miss Me? These songs, some of which you may recognize, are cornerstones of the modern, the American acoustic music tradition, bluegrass and otherwise. All right, so between the radio programs that Mike talked about, the recordings that the Carter family sold, the distribution of music became ever broader. And then we had this interesting phenomenon, what are called border blaster radios, or sometimes known as Mexican radio. And it does not simply refer to the Mexican restaurant up in Hudson, but they got their name from the fact that there were these Mexican radio stations that broadcasted something like 500,000 watts. They were so powerful that you could hear them clear across, they were situated on the border across from Texas. So just out of reach of the FCC, which put limitations on how strong your signal could be. They could broadcast all the way to Canada, the far reaches of Canada, east and west corner. I mean, everyone heard it. They used to say you could tie a string and a tin can and string to a barbed wire fence, and you'd hear XERA, Mexican radio. And the Carter family ended up there in 1938 and 39, and they performed twice a day, morning and evening. They were a daily phenomenon, and so they were heard by pretty much everyone. Waylon Jennings tells stories about his dad driving the car up to the side of the house, and they clamped the connections from the radio to the car battery so they could listen to the radio. Everyone has stories as they do of listening to Grand Ole Opry to hearing the Carter family on XER Mexican radio, XERA. And at this point it became a multi-generational affair. Sarah and AP had a couple kids who joined the family, joined the performances, as did Maybelle's daughters, Helen, June, and Anita. And more on them soon. At the same time, however, Sarah and AP became estranged as a couple. Ultimately, they divorced in 1939. By late 1941, they kept this news quiet. Their reporting reputation continued. They had gotten so big, they were going to be the cover story of the December issue of Life magazine in 1941. The photo shoot was done, the article was written, and as you know from history, early December 1941, attacking Pearl Harbor displaced their moment, the moment that would have been theirs to really become even more prominent. And their career sort of goes in decline. The original Carter family makes its last recordings in 1943, and AP and Sarah are separated permanently. This was their theme
There's the
song.
dark and the troubled side of life. There's the bright and the sunny side too. Though we meet with the darkness and strife, this sunny side we also may view. Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side of life. It will help us every day. It will brighten all the way. It will keep on the sunny side of life.
So that's how their show started, every morning and evening. That's why so many of you probably know that song. That's why it's so well loved. Mother Maybelle, as she came to be known, went on with her sisters, Helen, June, her daughters, known as the Carter sisters, Helen, June, and Anita, and they made it to Nashville ultimately and the Grand Ole Opry, and they became now the new generation. They had one foot in the early 20s and the origins of country music, and yet the younger girls kind of kept it fresh and current and contemporary. And here you see them performing a long way
The
from
history of the
Valley.
Carter family goes right back to the very grassroots of country music. They're here tonight, Mother Maybelle and Helen and Anita. Maybelle, I've often wondered if you do any of the old original Carter family songs.
We sure do, Judd, and we'd like to do one right now. This one is called Keep On the Sunny Side.
Here's a Carter.
There's a dark and a troubled side of life. There's a bright and a sunny side too. Though we meet with the darkness and strife, the sunny side we also may view. Keep on the sunny side, always on the sunny side. Keep on the sunny side.
You can see her scratching. She's picking the notes with her thumb and strumming with her fingers. Maybelle, Mother Maybelle on the left.
It will keep on the sunny side of life.
Okay, well, over the years, since that time, there have been many revivals, explicit or not so explicit, of the Carter family tradition and legacy. In 1961, we had Earl Scruggs and Lester Flatt, who by then had struck out on their own, having left the Bill Monroe group, and they recorded an entire album called Songs of the Famous Carter Family. In the early 70s, a new generation of kind of hippie folkies known as the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, put together a fabulous 3-record album that many of you may be familiar with, called Will the Circle Be Unbroken? And Mother Maybelle actually has the top billing there. And it was a real all-star gathering of musicians from all these different strains of country music. And then most recently, as I mentioned before, the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou featured a couple of Carter family tunes and again reawakened everyone's interest in these musical traditions. So here's a short medley with little clips from each one. Moving right along, the influences continue. Chet Atkins actually came to Nashville on the coattails of the Maybelle Carter and the Carter sisters. Johnny Cash went on to marry June Carter, who became known as June Carter Cash, and brought them in on his traveling road show. And finally, just to tie things together, the influence on Bluegrass, and Bill Monroe especially, was firstly in the songs. The songs that they popularized remained a part of the Bluegrass canon, both the songs of the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers, as I alluded to. The guitar style of Maybelle was a backbone of all guitar styles in bluegrass music and acoustic music. The harmony vocals, especially the high-piercing, high-lonesome sound. And finally, their presentation. As you noticed, all these folks we showed you were not playing the hayseed. They were not, other than Snuffy Jenkins, was looking a little country. But they dressed very dapper. This is a picture of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. And you can see they've got the cowboy hats, they've got the suits. And this was something that the Carter family also did very especially. They made a point of presenting themselves as fashionable and urbane and serious. And so finally, we have a short clip of Foggy Mountain Top. Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, followed by the Carter family.
If I was on some foggy mountain top, I'd sail away to the west. I'd sail all around this whole wide world to the girl I love.
Okay, for the sake of time here, I want to get these guys performing. Kalia hails from the heart of bluegrass country, Alaska. But she plays as if she's from Kentucky. So, anyway, one quick trivia while they're setting up here. Speaking of Ralph Peer, I just stumbled across this the other day. But when he was working for OK Records, recruiting, looking up, signing up talent, one group he signed, they just identified themselves as a bunch of hillbillies, which was the first use of that term, apparently, and hence it became labeled hillbilly music, just as race records and hillbilly records. Anyway, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to real music here. We have Eric on guitar, Lynn on bass, Kalia on fiddle, and Jerry on banjo, on 5-string. So give him a big hand, please.
Like you said, my name's Kalia, and I am indeed from Alaska.
I'm also a student at Vassar College, so that's how I met these guys. And so we're just going to play some songs, and you're more than welcome to ask any questions you have. I'll answer what I can. So anything about the fiddle, about the instruments, about the songs themselves, go for it.
You want to say?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, if you have any questions that you want to ask Kalia, go for it. You know, why she's playing it. You want to know how old she was when she started?
Figure out how old I am now.
You don't tell that part, but you were really young when you started.
Yeah, I started when I was 4. I started with the Suzuki method also, which is like a classical kind of method, a series of 10 books. But I did fiddling right off the bat too. There's actually a pretty healthy folk music scene up in Alaska. We need something to do in the winter.
And it's a family tradition, isn't it?
It is, yeah. My dad was a bluegrass musician too. So I was witnessing that, experiencing that as I grew up. I still spend my summers going to all these Alaskan music festivals that happen. It's a good way to go.
Why don't we play this through once, just the banjo and the fiddle, and then you can come in. Okay? Soldier's Joy.
We heard a clip of it earlier.
That was the very first thing you heard.
Yes.
And there were words to it.
Yeah, they're kind of eerie, actually.
Yes,
They're-
it's about morphine.
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 Yeah.
The Civil War.
Morphine.
Do you folks generally use sheet music, or do you just learn it from somebody else?
That's a good question. With a lot of the fiddle tunes that I learned most of them by ear. It's kind of how most of the music was passed on, honestly. These days, you can get just about anything written down. Lots of people make their living transcribing versions of songs. But nope, this is very much an oral tradition. Yeah.
Sometimes it's better not to read the music, because if you learn it by music, that's the way you play it. Kalia is actually making music.
All right. So this is a tune called Angela and Baker. Sure. We can do that again. Yeah, but a little bit. About the same tempo. Is that gonna work? All right.
Let's do one. Right. This is a more of an old-timey tune that for some reason I give it kind of a Cajun feel, which isn't necessarily original, but it's a fun song. The version I know is from a fiddler named Bruce Molsky, who was pretty involved in kind of the revival of old-time music, kind of bringing it back into
Well, in fact, if I could just point out, we have two instruments here that are fretted. The fretted players are the banjo and the guitar have these metal bars up and down the neck. Make it a lot easier to play in tune, but you can only play in those particular steps, those half steps. These two instruments, based on a much older instruments, basically both in the violin family, have no frets, and so they can slip and slide in and out of every microtone that you might want or not want. So it's a credit to Lynn and Kalia how well and precisely they play, but it also makes for wonderful effects that they can generate. I don't know if
all that. I do a lot of that. There's different words for it. I don't know. All of that like slippy slidey stuff. You can't do that on an instrument that has frets. You do. Yeah, you sort of. There you go. There's like different techniques to get that sound. But in many ways, it's kind of attempting to sound like instruments that do that already. All right, so we're doing a song called Lazy John. We're in D. It starts on that. Yeah, you're right.
It starts on it. Yeah, you're right.
What ages did the other players start? Start, not now.
Yeah, Jerry, when did you start?
What age did I start playing? What age did I start? Probably about 18.
Oh, wow.
That was true for my father too. He picked up the banjo.
That was 5 years ago.
Mine was 5 years ago. I started playing this 5 years ago.
Wow.
I know, right?
That is
That's so
really
nice.
old.
I've been playing music since I was about 9 years old, but I started guitar about 10 years ago. I was a bassist for a long time, but when my daughter was born, I wanted to be able to sing songs to her, so I picked up the guitar. So, I can mark how long I've been playing by.